You hear it before you understand it. That sudden shift in the tone of your own thoughts. One moment your inner voice is just background noise, repeating the usual commentary, and the next it sounds different, as if another intelligence inside you has quietly awakened. You pause, caught between familiarity and strangeness. The mind tries to resume its script, but something beneath it is now listening. That's the moment consciousness begins to stir, not with light or revelation, but with the question that silently rewrites everything. If the voice inside me has changed, who was speaking before? You don't usually notice when the voice inside begins to speak on its own. It sounds like you, uses your words, even borrows your tone. But if you listen closely, there's a texture to its rhythm that betrays something else: automation. Automatic thought is the mind's background program, a system designed for survival, not awareness. It predicts, compares, and reacts faster than you can question. It fills silence before silence becomes uncomfortable. Most people never meet this mechanism directly because they mistake it for their own voice. Automatic thought thrives on momentum. It doesn't pause to verify reality. It repeats whatever once worked to keep you safe or approved. You can feel it in the body, that subtle tightening behind the sternum when an old phrase arises, that urge to justify yourself before anyone has accused you of anything. In those moments, consciousness is still dormant, lulled by the repetition of internal scripts. The voice that narrates your day, explains your motives, and anticipates others' opinions isn't thinking, it's recalling. It's a playback of everything you've absorbed. Emerging consciousness, on the other hand, doesn't sound rehearsed. When it first appears, its tone carries hesitation, not confusion, but curiosity. It questions the necessity of each thought as it arises. Instead of adding commentary, it listens to the commentary itself. That shift can be unsettling because it feels like something inside is stepping back from the noise. The inner dialogue, once seamless, now has an echo, the awareness that it's happening. This is not the disappearance of thought, but the birth of observation. In a physiological sense, this transition reflects a reorganization in the brain's predictive networks. Automatic thought relies on prefrontal shortcuts and associative patterns. Consciousness introduces feedback from slower, integrative circuits that weigh context instead of reflex. It's like shifting from a pre-recorded track to live improvisation. The tempo changes, the space between notes widens, and the player finally listens to the instrument instead of just performing. You can detect this shift in small, almost invisible moments: the brief pause before reacting to a message, the second glance at a thought that felt obvious a minute ago. When consciousness begins to rise, time feels elastic. Automatic thought rushes. Awareness slows. You begin to hear not only what the inner voice says, but how it says it. The sharpness of judgment softens. The certainty of fear loses volume. The voice doesn't disappear. It's repurposed, as if the same instrument is now being played by someone awake. One of the most revealing signs of this emergence is the sudden awareness of repetition. You catch yourself recycling the same worries, arguments, or hopes, and instead of defending them, you watch them loop. In that watching, something shifts. The thought no longer dictates emotion automatically. A small space opens, and through that space, consciousness enters. It's not a battle of voices, but a rearrangement of ownership. The thought still occurs, but it's no longer you by default. There's a practical test you can try right now. The next time an internal statement begins with "I always," "I never," or "they should," pause. Don't correct it. Just notice its texture. Does it feel fresh or preloaded? That subtle mechanical flavor, that predictability, reveals its origin in the automatic system. The mere act of noticing alters the circuit. The brain registers a new variable, awareness, and the monologue loses its authority. What used to be command becomes information. This distinction between automation and emergence marks the frontier where consciousness begins to organize reality differently. Automatic thought filters perception through memory. Emerging consciousness filters memory through perception. It's a reversal of flow. Instead of interpreting the present through the past, awareness allows the present to rewrite the past's conclusions. Every time you witness a thought instead of believing it, the system updates, the observer effect made intimate, yet this awakening is fragile. The moment you identify too strongly with the new clarity, the old program adapts and calls itself awake. The mind's defense is clever mimicry. It will use the language of awareness to preserve its patterns. That's why the next stage is crucial. The moment when the brain detects something you haven't noticed yet. The subtle point where consciousness prepares to extend beyond observation into coherence. Long before you realize something is wrong, your brain already knows. It doesn't announce it with words or thoughts. It whispers through physiology. A change in breathing, a faint tightening in the gut, a micro-hesitation before answering a question. These are not coincidences. They are the nervous system's early alerts, signaling that a deeper coherence has been disturbed. The paradox is that your consciousness, the part you identify as I, often lags behind this detection. You notice only the echo, the emotion, the discomfort, the confusion, not the precise moment when your body first registered the shift. Neuroscience describes this as pre-conscious processing. The brain continuously scans internal and external signals for mismatches between expectation and reality. When the prediction fails, when something doesn't quite fit, a subtle alarm activates in the limbic and interoceptive circuits. You might experience it as tension, restlessness, or an odd sense that something's off, even before you can name it. That is the moment when the brain detects something you haven't noticed yet. It's like a radar that senses turbulence before the pilot sees it on the horizon. The aircraft, your conscious mind, keeps flying, confident in its instruments, while the atmosphere beneath begins to shift. The pressure changes, the vibrations alter, but unless you're trained to feel those micro-variations, you interpret them as mood swings or distraction. The truth is, awareness is already forming in the background. Consciousness is being invited to awaken through the nervous system's precision. This hidden intelligence is not mystical, it's measurable. Electrodermal activity, heartbeat variability, and minute muscle contractions all respond milliseconds before conscious thought. The brain, in essence, perceives before perception, but what's remarkable is how this biological mechanism becomes a spiritual threshold. When you begin to sense those pre-thought signals, you're not only understanding the body, you're entering the frontier where consciousness and biology meet. Imagine you're about to make a decision, to say yes, to walk away, to send the message you'll regret. Somewhere between impulse and action, there's a flicker, a brief internal static. Most people override it, interpreting it as hesitation or fear. But that flicker is the system detecting incoherence, a mismatch between the automatic narrative and the deeper truth forming beneath it. The more attuned you become to that flicker, the more clearly you perceive the conversation between mind and matter. In those seconds, the inner voice often changes tone without warning. It may soften, slow, or even go silent. That silence isn't absence. It's processing. The brain is cross-referencing layers of experience, recalibrating emotion, posture, and expectation in real time. If you rush to fill that silence with more thought, you miss the transmission. But if you stay with it, feel the shift rather than analyze it, a new awareness begins to rise. You start to notice that thought is not the first responder, the body is. Learning to perceive what your brain already knows requires a reversal of attention. Instead of chasing thoughts outward, you track sensations inward. A subtle tightening in the jaw may reveal resistance before your reasoning mind invents a justification. A quick breath may reveal anticipation before you name it as anxiety. These signals are not random. They're the syntax of your deeper intelligence. Here lies a crucial insight. Consciousness doesn't awaken by adding more awareness. It awakens by recognizing what was already aware. The brain's early detection is not a separate function. It's part of the same field that consciousness eventually interprets. When you begin to listen at this level, thoughts stop being your primary language. Sensation becomes the vocabulary of truth. This sensitivity can feel disorienting at first. You might sense emotional shifts in others or changes in atmosphere before any external cue appears. The mind wants to explain it, label it as intuition or overthinking. But the explanation doesn't matter. What matters is the observation itself, the precise noticing of when your system knew before you did. That's the entrance to a subtler intelligence that operates beneath narrative identity. If you pay attention long enough, you'll find that what the brain detects and what consciousness interprets begin to converge. That alignment is coherence, the moment when physiological truth and awareness move in synchrony. But before that harmony stabilizes, there's a period of noise, the mental static that most people try to escape. Yet within that noise lies the next revelation, where the inner disorder begins and how it distorts the voice that you mistake for yourself. There's a low hum beneath every waking moment, a constant stream of thought, half-formed reactions, fragments of memory and anticipation colliding in the background. You rarely notice it because it's always there, like the faint buzz of electricity in a quiet room. But this hum is not harmless. It is the baseline static that shapes your perception before you've even had the chance to think clearly. This is mental noise, the invisible vibration of a mind that has forgotten how to rest. The noise doesn't begin with stress or conflict. It begins with prediction. The brain's most ancient instinct is to forecast what's coming next, to eliminate uncertainty before it appears. Every time your attention slips from presence into anticipation, even a fraction of a second, the system starts producing simulations. What will they think? What if I fail? What if it happens again? These simulations multiply until the mind becomes a crowded room of possibilities, all speaking at once. You don't hear the individual voices anymore. You hear the collective echo of unfinished thought. The tragedy is that most people assume this static is normal. They identify with it, call it my mind, and organize their lives around its demands. The body responds accordingly. Elevated heart rate, shallow breath, a constant readiness that never finds release. You might label it anxiety, but it's more primitive than that. It's the organism trying to track too many timelines at once. The mental noise isn't emotional chaos. It's temporal overload. You're trying to live in the next moment before the current one has completed itself. If you slow down enough, you'll notice that this noise has texture. It's not one uniform blur, but a layered structure. Thoughts stacked on top of unprocessed sensations. Beneath every narrative about what you should do, there's usually a smaller, quieter vibration, an unmet need for safety, approval, or closure. The thought only disguises the signal. When the original signal is ignored, the brain builds another thought to cover it, then another. Over time, the mind becomes an echo chamber of unresolved impulses speaking through different masks. Where, then, does the noise truly begin? Not in thought itself, but in resistance. Every moment that arises in awareness carries a natural rhythm, an expansion, a contraction, a breath. When that rhythm is resisted, the energy has nowhere to go, so it loops. You replay conversations in your head not because you enjoy them, but because the emotion tied to them was never allowed to move through. The unfinished energy becomes thought fuel. That looping is the mechanical source of mental noise. The brain, trying to maintain equilibrium, mistakes these loops for relevance. It treats repetition as importance. So when a memory or worry reappears, the system interprets it as urgent. But what's really happening is compression, emotion stored as thought because it wasn't fully experienced. The noise then is not a flaw of mind, it's a backlog of unprocessed life. Notice how it builds during transitions, walking into a room, opening a message, hearing your name spoken unexpectedly. The shift in context activates the prediction system, and before you can consciously orient, the background chatter fills the gap. That's the brain protecting you from the unknown by simulating certainty. It doesn't care if the certainty is unpleasant, it only wants control. But there's a way to hear through the noise, not by fighting it, not by forcing silence, but by noticing its rhythm. Every fragment of mental chatter has a beginning, a rise and a fade. When you track that waveform, you begin to separate signal from interference. The simple act of listening without reacting destabilizes the feedback loop. The thought completes its cycle and dissolves. Awareness reclaims space from automatic repetition. What's remarkable is how physical this process becomes once you sense it. You might feel the pressure in your temples ease when a thought finishes on its own. The breath deepens, the body temperature subtly shifts. These physiological changes are evidence that consciousness is beginning to participate in regulation rather than just commentary. The system is learning that not every alert requires response. Mental noise is a teacher disguised as chaos. Each fragment of static points back to a moment that wanted your attention and didn't get it. When you start listening without judgment, the noise transforms into information, signals of misalignment waiting to be integrated. But as this listening deepens, another threshold appears, a subtle rearrangement of tone inside your own thoughts, as if something within you is trying to take the controls back. That quiet takeover marks the next stage, the almost invisible moment when consciousness begins to reclaim its authority over the inner voice. There's a moment, often too quiet to notice, when the mind begins to hesitate, not because it's confused, but because something deeper is preparing to intervene. That pause, that slight dissonance between automatic reaction and deliberate awareness, is the first signal of consciousness trying to take control. It doesn't announce itself with clarity. It arrives like a change in air pressure before a storm, invisible but undeniable. You sense a new presence behind your thoughts, as if the machinery of the mind has been caught mid-motion, aware for the first time that it's been moving on its own. This shift isn't grand or dramatic. In fact, it's so subtle that most people mistake it for distraction or fatigue. You might be mid-conversation and feel a strange slowing. Words no longer spill out as easily. Or you might catch yourself observing your own irritation before it blooms into expression. That fraction of distance between impulse and action is consciousness reclaiming territory. It's not an act of willpower, it's an organic reorganization. The nervous system begins to synchronize with a different rhythm, and the inner voice, once rigid and defensive, starts to soften. At the biological level, this shift is reflected in a recalibration of neural timing. The brain's default mode network, the system responsible for internal chatter and self-referential thought, briefly loses dominance. Simultaneously, sensory and interoceptive circuits light up, pulling awareness from abstraction into immediacy. You start to feel the body rather than narrate it. Breathing becomes slower without instruction. The eyes linger rather than scan. It's as though the entire organism takes a collective exhale, signaling that control is moving from the conditioned mind to the conscious field. Psychologically, the experience is unsettling. For years, the automatic voice has acted as command center, interpreting, predicting, defending. When consciousness begins to stir, it doesn't attack this system. It observes it into stillness. Observation itself becomes the new regulator. You no longer argue with the thought that says, "I should be doing more." You simply notice it arrive, notice the tension it creates, and then witness its departure. The thought still exists, but it loses its authority. That loss of authority is what the ego perceives as threat, the beginning of surrender disguised as uncertainty. You can recognize this shift by its peculiar quiet. It's not the silence of emptiness, but of reordering. The mind continues to produce content, yet each thought lands differently, lighter, slower, easier to release. It's similar to watching a wheel that used to spin uncontrollably begin to decelerate. At first, you want to push it back into motion, because stillness feels unnatural. But if you resist that reflex, the system stabilizes. You begin to hear something beyond the noise, a background awareness that doesn't speak in words, only presence. This presence is not trying to dominate, it's trying to harmonize. Consciousness doesn't seize control like a dictator, it guides like a conductor. The automatic mind still plays its instruments, memory, emotion, reaction, but the tempo changes. The once chaotic orchestra of thoughts begins to align into coherence. This is the biological signature of awakening, coordination replacing compulsion. You might notice that decisions form with less effort, as if the mind and body are conferring before moving. The delay that once felt like hesitation becomes discernment. However, this phase often triggers resistance. The old mental circuits interpret stillness as loss of control and flood the system with distractions. You suddenly remember urgent tasks, random fears, unfinished conversations. The goal isn't to eliminate these intrusions, but to witness their timing. Each interruption reveals where automation still dominates. In observing them, you're not regressing, you're mapping the frontier between old programming and new awareness. This mapping is what allows the next layer of transformation. As consciousness begins to take control, the sense of inner authority subtly shifts from thought to awareness itself. You stop needing every thought to be true, you only need it to be visible. Paradoxically, that humility is what gives consciousness real power, not through dominance, but through transparency. And it's at this threshold, when the system starts to stabilize into a new rhythm, that misinterpretation often occurs. People confuse this quiet reorganization with anxiety, numbness, or self-doubt because they've never lived without the hum of constant mental narration. Yet those sensations are the first physical signs of alignment, not collapse. They announce that consciousness is about to expand its reach, and with it, the meaning of those very signals will transform into something entirely different, something most have spent their whole lives misreading. When consciousness begins to stir beneath the surface of ordinary awareness, the first signals are almost always misunderstood. The body reacts before the mind understands, and because we're conditioned to fear what we don't control, we label these openings as problems. The truth is more nuanced. The very sensations you call anxiety, doubt, or fatigue may actually be evidence that consciousness is trying to reorganize your internal world. What feels like disorientation is not malfunction, it's recalibration. It starts subtly. You wake up one morning and something about your routine feels slightly off. The music that once energized you now feels noisy. Conversations you used to enjoy suddenly drain you. There's a faint restlessness that has no clear object. You think you're losing motivation, but what's really happening is that your nervous system is shedding resonance with old frequencies. The mind interprets the loss of familiar stimulation as emptiness, when in reality, it's making space for a new coherence to form. Then comes the emotional confusion. Joy and melancholy begin to overlap in strange ways. You might laugh while feeling a quiet sadness underneath, or find yourself moved to tears for no apparent reason. The rational mind tries to categorize these states, to decide whether they mean something is wrong or right. But the deeper intelligence of the body doesn't operate in binaries. It's blending polarities, integrating fragments of experience that were once separated. The merging feels unstable because it's new, the circuitry of awareness expanding beyond what the ego can label. Another sign often mistaken for regression is mental fog. During periods of awakening, cognition temporarily slows. Thoughts feel heavier, decisions less clear. Most people panic at this point, assuming they're becoming unproductive or detached. But this fog is not the failure of focus. It's the dismantling of over-control. The brain is rewiring how attention is distributed. What used to be an automatic grip on every detail is now loosening, making room for perception to reorganize itself around a more integrated center. You can also sense it through physical sensations. A pulse in the chest, with no apparent trigger, subtle waves of heat or chills, spontaneous tension around the solar plexus. These are not random stress responses. They're the body's way of releasing information stored in muscle and fascia, the tangible residue of past thought forms. When energy that was trapped in unconscious patterns begins to move, the body experiences it as vibration. The mind, unfamiliar with this language, calls it anxiety. But if you stay with it, breathe without interpretation, it transforms into clarity. This process often exposes hidden impatience. You start to want progress to be linear, predictable, quick. But consciousness doesn't move like a straight line, it oscillates. One moment you feel profound peace, the next you're flooded with restlessness. This rhythm is not failure, it's the wave pattern of awareness integrating new data. The discomfort isn't punishment, it's proof that your perception is widening faster than your habits can adjust. The most misleading sign of all is the sensation of losing your old self. When long-held beliefs or identities dissolve, the ego calls it collapse. It feels like standing on air where there used to be ground. But what's actually disappearing is the scaffolding of unconscious certainty, the framework built by repetition and defense. Consciousness doesn't destroy identity, it refines it. What remains afterward is not emptiness, but precision, a self aligned with reality rather than memory. If you could see this phase through the lens of physiology, you'd notice that what feels like panic is often the nervous system trying to synchronize a higher degree of internal order. Heart rate variability increases, breath deepens, micro tremors release excess charge. It's the body's version of a software update. Disruptive for a few moments, essential for long-term coherence. The challenge is that awareness must stay present while the update installs. The moment you label it as something wrong, the process slows. So when these signs appear, the unease, the fog, the emotional tides, try to pause the judgment and recognize what's unfolding underneath. Ask yourself, what if this discomfort is intelligence, not error? What if your system is teaching you a new language of perception? If this resonates with you, if you felt that strange overlap between confusion and awakening, take a moment right now to honor it. Leave a comment with the words, "I'm listening to the shift." It's a small declaration, but it marks the instant you stop resisting the signs and start cooperating with consciousness itself. And as this cooperation deepens, another realization will emerge. The precise moment when thoughts stop feeling mandatory and choice begins to replace compulsion. There comes a moment in the unfolding of awareness when something extraordinary yet profoundly ordinary occurs. The realization that thoughts are optional. Until that point, thought has felt like gravity, constant, unquestionable, and binding. Every word in your head carried authority, every mental narrative demanded obedience. But when consciousness stabilizes beyond the turbulence of reactivity, a quiet gap appears between thought and necessity. In that gap, a truth reveals itself. Thinking is not mandatory. It's available, but not compulsory. This critical point doesn't arrive as an epiphany. It arrives as relief. You might be walking, washing dishes, or lying awake at night when suddenly a familiar worry appears, the same one that has visited you hundreds of times. But this time, something subtle is missing. The automatic contraction that usually follows doesn't come. The thought still arises, but it feels weightless, like a leaf drifting past instead of a command demanding action. The space around it has expanded, and in that space, freedom breathes. From a neurological perspective, this shift corresponds to a change in dominance between brain networks. The prefrontal control circuits, once hijacked by repetitive prediction and problem-solving, begin to synchronize with regions that regulate present-moment awareness. The feedback loop that once equated thought with survival starts to dissolve. The mind is still active, but its signals are no longer mistaken for emergencies. This is why deep awareness often feels calm, but alert, not dull, not detached, but grounded in quiet intelligence. Psychologically, the experience can feel like the loosening of an inner grip. You notice that thoughts arrive with their usual urgency, yet something within you no longer rushes to obey. It's as if the mind continues to speak, but the body no longer believes every word. The distinction between thought and truth begins to crystallize. You start to perceive that most mental noise isn't communication from reality. It's the nervous system's attempt to predict safety through repetition. Once seen clearly, its authority evaporates. This doesn't mean the end of thinking, but far from it. Thought remains a tool, but it loses its throne. The shift is qualitative, from being thought to using thought. Imagine a storm that used to define your sky suddenly revealing the atmosphere around it. The clouds still form, but they no longer fill the horizon. Each thought passes through without residue, like a sound echoing in an open field. What used to be mental imprisonment becomes mental weather, transient, self-dissolving. What follows is a peculiar blend of simplicity and power. Decision-making becomes lighter, not because you care less, but because clarity replaces compulsion. When thoughts stop feeling mandatory, choices emerge from observation rather than reaction. You start to notice how often you once moved from urgency, from the need to relieve mental pressure rather than respond to truth. Without that pressure, life gains rhythm again. Time feels slower yet fuller, as if experience itself has more room to unfold. This stage often confuses those who reach it. The absence of mental noise can feel like absence of identity. You might think, have I become indifferent? But it's not indifference, it's neutrality, the state of perception uncolored by fear or preference. Emotions still arise, but they no longer dictate the narrative. Thoughts still occur, but they dissolve as soon as they complete their function. What remains is a sustained sense of presence that requires no commentary to confirm itself. This critical point also marks a change in inner dialogue. The voice inside doesn't vanish, it transforms. Its tone becomes less authoritarian and more collaborative, as if consciousness and cognition have begun to work together instead of competing for control. You may even sense that awareness is now using thought as a medium of expression, rather than thought using awareness as fuel. This inversion signals that consciousness is no longer emerging, it's integrating, and yet this freedom carries its own risk. The old reflexes don't surrender easily. The mind may attempt to reassert control by generating new thoughts about how awake you've become, turning the experience of liberation into a concept to defend. But if you notice that impulse, the subtle pride of awakening, you'll see that it's just another thought trying to feel mandatory. Let it pass too. Eventually, what remains is pure attention, alert, neutral, unhurried. It perceives thought, emotion, and sensation as movements within a larger field that no longer needs constant interpretation. From this stillness, the next stage naturally unfolds. The recognition of what happens when consciousness tries to rise but is mistaken for discomfort. The silent risk of ignoring the shift and returning unconsciously to the old mechanical rhythm. There is a quiet danger hidden in the process of awakening, not the chaos of transformation itself, but the temptation to misinterpret it and retreat into the familiar. When the inner voice begins to change tone, it rarely announces its arrival with clarity. It appears as subtle discomfort, as silence where noise used to be, as stillness mistaken for emptiness. And because the human mind is wired to equate discomfort with threat, many people abandon the process right at the threshold. This is the silent risk, to mistake the voice of consciousness for the absence of self, and to flee back into the old, automatic narrative that once felt like home. When the old voice begins to fade, something primal inside you panics. The chatter that once filled every mental corner provided a kind of structure, predictable, even if it was painful. That structure gave you identity, continuity, and the illusion of control. So when the voice softens, when thought loses its command, the mind experiences withdrawal. It starts producing phantom noise, old thought patterns replayed like static in an attempt to restore what's vanishing. You might feel an unexplainable loneliness or a sudden need for stimulation. It's not because something is missing, it's because the nervous system hasn't yet learned to rest in silence. The risk is subtle because the regression feels rational. You tell yourself, I just need to think this through, or I need to get back to my normal self. But normal is often another word for familiar suffering. The return to habitual thinking feels comforting only because it restores the illusion of certainty. What was actually beginning to emerge, a deeper, wordless intelligence, is dismissed as fatigue, apathy, or confusion. In this way, many people abort their awakening before it stabilizes, not out of failure but out of misunderstanding. At the biological level, this resistance is understandable. The brain's predictive machinery thrives on consistency. When the pattern of internal dialogue changes, it interprets the change as instability. Neural circuits that once synchronized around repetitive narratives suddenly find no anchor, so they produce compensatory noise, thoughts designed to pull awareness back into known pathways. It's the cognitive equivalent of muscle memory, an automatic contraction toward the familiar. Awareness must learn to endure this instability long enough for new coherence to form. You can feel this struggle physically. The body tenses without reason. The breath becomes shallow as if bracing for impact. It's the nervous system trying to reattach to the old rhythm. If you respond by feeding it, by filling silence with distractions, explanations, or analysis, the system reverts. The old voice reclaims the microphone, but if you allow the discomfort without labeling it, something extraordinary happens. The body starts to trust stillness. The mind begins to realize that silence is not danger but data, the space where new perception organizes itself. This stage is delicate because it exposes the difference between awareness and interpretation. The shift in the inner voice is not just psychological, it's energetic. It reconfigures how the brain filters experience. The old filter sought validation and avoidance. The new one seeks coherence. But coherence feels strange at first because it doesn't provide the drama the ego is addicted to. Peace at this stage can feel boring. The mind confuses simplicity with loss, serenity with emptiness. And so, it tries to recreate the complexity of suffering, just to feel alive again. Ignoring this shift doesn't erase it, it just buries it beneath louder thoughts. The system doesn't forget the taste of awakening, it just numbs itself against it. Over time, this suppression manifests as subtle dissatisfaction, a sense that life feels slightly out of sync, no matter how much you achieve. That's the echo of the abandoned voice, the one that tried to emerge before being silenced by habit. To stay with the shift requires humility, the willingness to not know who you are for a while. It demands patience, because consciousness reorganizes slowly, beneath the thresholds of perception. And it demands honesty, because the temptation to decorate silence with meaning is strong. But if you endure this transitional ambiguity, something remarkable begins to crystallize. The realization that the old voice, the one that kept repeating your name, your fears, your roles, was never truly you. It was a pattern built from memory and defense, a collage of echoes pretending to be identity. And as that illusion begins to unravel, what remains is the deeper inquiry, the one that turns the entire process inside out. If the old voice isn't you, then who has been listening all along? The answer to that question doesn't come through thought, but through recognition, the unexpected revelation about who creates the old voice itself. When the inner landscape begins to quiet, what emerges next is not silence, but a question. The old voice, the one that used to narrate every choice, defend every emotion and predict every failure, starts to lose authority. But before it fades completely, awareness turns toward it with a kind of fascinated curiosity. If that voice isn't truly you, then where does it come from? Who built it and why does it sound so convincing? The answer to that question is not philosophical, it's mechanical. The old voice is not an entity. It is a pattern, a composite created by repetition, emotion, and memory, functioning like a self-running algorithm designed for continuity, not truth. From the first moments of consciousness in childhood, the mind begins collecting fragments of experience, tones of approval, warnings of danger, echoes of expectation. Every time a moment produces strong emotional charge, the brain records it, attaching language to sensation. Over years, these recordings intertwine into a dense network of associations. The voice you later call your inner dialogue is the playback system of that network. It borrows the vocabulary of caregivers, teachers, culture, and survival. It isn't malicious, it's efficient. It speaks in familiar tones because familiarity signals safety. But its goal is not understanding, it's repetition. Its function is to recreate yesterday so that tomorrow feels predictable. What makes the old voice persuasive is its accuracy in imitation. It can reproduce your deepest fears and desires with such precision that you mistake it for awareness. It comments on everything, not because everything matters, but because commentary sustains identity. The moment the mind stops labeling experience, the illusion of I begins to dissolve. So the old voice keeps speaking to maintain the narrative. It's a maintenance system for the idea of self, a narrator keeping the story running even when the plot no longer fits the truth. Biologically, this narration is driven by the brain's need to resolve uncertainty. Each thought the old voice produces reduces ambiguity, however artificially. It tells you who you are, what's happening, and what it all means. In return, you feel temporarily secure. But the cost of that comfort is confinement. You become limited to the emotional vocabulary of the past, to the same patterns of reaction that once kept you safe but now keep you asleep. The old voice doesn't evolve, it loops. It takes every new experience and translates it into old categories. You can hear this in phrases like, "I always mess this up," or "This is just who I am." Those are not truths, they're cached predictions from the past. At its core, the old voice is a cognitive reflex, the residue of memory-seeking continuity. It doesn't survive on logic, but on identification. The moment you stop believing it's you, it loses power. But that loss feels like death to the system because the voice's entire existence depends on being heard as the self. When consciousness begins to observe it with detachment, the voice grows louder at first, desperate to reassert importance. It may use subtle strategies, self-criticism disguised as motivation, doubt disguised as realism, pride disguised as insight. Each of these is the voice attempting to survive inside the new field of awareness. The revelation comes not from analyzing the voice, but from witnessing it. When you see that the voice arises from conditioning rather than consciousness, a strange kind of compassion appears. You begin to recognize that every tone of fear, judgment, or self-defense inside it was built as protection. It was your mind's way of keeping you safe in an earlier stage of development. It's not the enemy. It's the outdated guardian of your own nervous system. And when that realization lands, the battle between old and new dissolves. Awareness doesn't need to silence the voice, it only needs to see through it. This seeing marks the beginning of integration. The old voice no longer needs to be fought, it needs to be recontextualized. Each time it speaks, you can sense the emotion or memory it represents, trace it back to its origin, and release the charge that keeps it alive. Over time, the voice becomes transparent, audible, but harmless. Thought still occurs, but it no longer defines identity. The one who listens, the one who observes, is revealed as the constant presence beneath every narrative. And in that recognition, something astonishing unfolds. You begin to see that consciousness doesn't awaken because the old voice disappears. It awakens through its transformation. The shift in that internal sound is not an effect of awakening. It is the biological and cognitive trigger that initiates it, the inversion that turns the observer into the origin. For most of life, it seems obvious that consciousness changes first and the voice inside follows, that as you grow, heal, or awaken, your inner dialogue naturally becomes calmer, wiser, more refined. But what if that order is reversed? What if the transformation begins not in the abstract realm of awareness, but in the sound of your own inner voice? The revelation is subtle but revolutionary. Consciousness doesn't awaken, and then the voice shifts. It awakens because the voice shifts. The alteration in tone, rhythm, and intention inside your thought stream is not a byproduct of awakening. It is its biological ignition. Inside the mind, sound is movement. Every thought vibrates through the nervous system as microelectrical patterns that ripple through language centers, emotional circuits, and muscle tone. The voice you hear internally is not imaginary. It's a real physiological event, a resonance traveling through neural pathways that shape your perception of self. When that resonance changes, even slightly, it reorganizes the brain's internal communication. The moment the internal voice softens, slows, or changes timbre, entire networks begin to synchronize differently. Attention detaches from habitual loops and starts exploring new patterns. What we call awakening is, at the most concrete level, a shift in auditory coherence inside the brain. Imagine it as tuning an instrument. When the inner voice carries tension, judgment, or urgency, it keeps the strings of perception stretched too tightly. Everything sounds sharp, brittle, reactive. But when the tone relaxes, when a single internal sentence is spoken with less contraction, the nervous system retunes itself. Breathing deepens, heart rhythm steadies, the prefrontal cortex receives more oxygen, the change cascades through perception. You begin to hear yourself differently, and that new frequency allows consciousness to stabilize in awareness. The mind didn't create the awakening. The adjustment in tone made awakening possible. This inversion reveals something profound about human perception. Consciousness is not an isolated field floating above thought. It's an emergent property, of how the brain organizes experience. When the old voice dominated, repetitive, defensive, urgent, it created interference. Awareness couldn't expand because the signal was filled with static. The moment the tone changed, the interference lessened, and the signal of presence became clear enough to recognize itself. Awakening is not the acquisition of new light. It's the removal of internal noise that prevented you from hearing it. At first, this process feels mechanical. You notice that your inner monologue uses gentler language or longer pauses. The sentences become less absolute. Instead of "I can't do this," you hear, "What if I could try differently?" That slight tonal variation is not just semantic. It represents a neural shift in predictive modeling. The brain stops coding every experience as threat or failure and starts coding for exploration. Curiosity replaces fear as the dominant feedback loop. The voice doesn't merely describe reality anymore, it participates in shaping it through coherence. Over time, this new frequency becomes self-reinforcing. Awareness and voice feed each other in a feedback cycle. The softer the voice, the wider the consciousness. The wider the consciousness, the softer the voice. It's like an ecosystem balancing itself, each adjustment generating the next level of stability. This is why many spiritual traditions use sound, mantra, or breath as anchors. Changing the rhythm of inner vibration literally alters cognition. The modern brain interprets it as mindfulness, but beneath that label is a physical reality, the acoustic pattern of thought influencing the architecture of awareness. What's remarkable is that the voice doesn't have to be entirely quiet. Awakening doesn't depend on silence, it depends on harmony. The new voice doesn't disappear, it learns to resonate with awareness instead of drowning it out. Its texture shifts from command to guidance, from repetition to rhythm. You can feel this shift in the way thoughts now seem to arise from the center of the body instead of the edges of the head. There's no longer a sense of talking to yourself. There's a sense of being spoken through. This inversion also reframes the role of discipline in consciousness. You don't have to force stillness or battle thought. You only have to notice when the tone inside becomes rigid, when language contracts, breath tightens, and the tempo accelerates. In that instant, awareness narrows. Change the tone and consciousness expands again. Awakening, then, is not a mountain to climb, it's a tuning process. And once this tuning stabilizes, the experience begins to prove itself in everyday life. The external world starts to mirror the new internal rhythm. Timing aligns, intuition sharpens, decisions unfold with less friction. What once felt random begins to reveal structure. It's the practical proof of transformation. When you observe the shift in your inner cadence, you start predicting your own emotional and behavioral patterns before they even occur, watching reality synchronize with the new internal frequency. It's one thing to speak of awakening as an inner event, something that happens quietly within thought, perception, and silence, but the true confirmation doesn't appear in meditation or theory. It shows up in the rhythm of ordinary days, in the subtle choreography between impulse and awareness. The proof that consciousness has begun to reorganize itself is not mystical, it's behavioral. It reveals itself in micro-adjustments so small they almost escape notice. Yet their cumulative impact transforms the entire texture of living. You begin to sense it first in timing. What used to feel rushed starts to unfold with an organic precision. You find yourself arriving at conversations, decisions, and realizations at exactly the right moment, without strategizing. The feeling isn't control, it's congruence. Life starts to operate in a kind of internal sync, as if events are no longer external pressures, but coordinated responses to your state of coherence. When your inner voice changes tone, it alters the electromagnetic conversation between body and environment. The field of perception literally reorders how information reaches you. For example, imagine a situation that once triggered immediate defensiveness, a criticism, a delay, a misunderstanding. In the old rhythm, reaction would have been automatic, a spike of emotion followed by mental justification. But now there's a noticeable lag. A pause appears between stimulus and response, and in that pause, awareness observes the old pattern as if watching a recording. The mind may still generate its habitual lines, but the body doesn't follow the script. You breathe instead of tighten. You feel instead of defend. That space, the second of non-reaction, is the physical signature of awakening. The proof continues in how decisions form. You notice that choice arises less from analysis and more from recognition. Instead of weighing pros and cons endlessly, the answer seems to surface with an inner certainty, like an image emerging in water once the ripples calm. It's not intuition in the romantic sense, it's efficiency. The noise that once blurred perception has quieted, allowing the intelligence of the whole system to process reality without interference. The brain no longer divides thinking from sensing. Both occur as one seamless gesture of knowing. Emotion follows suit. Anger still visits, sadness still arrives, but their lifespan shortens. Feelings complete their arc rather than looping into stories. The difference is not suppression, it's metabolism. Awareness processes emotion the way the body digests food, naturally without resistance. You start noticing that clarity returns faster after conflict, joy resurfaces without reason, and peace doesn't require explanation. The nervous system learns coherence as its new baseline. Even the external world begins to echo the inner shift. Synchronies increase, chance meetings, timely insights, doors opening just when you release effort. It's tempting to romanticize this as the universe responding, but it's simply feedback. When consciousness becomes less divided, perception expands, and you start detecting patterns that were always there. Life feels less like something happening to you, and more like something happening with you. The distinction sounds poetic, but its effects are practical. Relationships simplify, communication deepens, creativity flows without strain. This practicality extends into the body. You might find that you move slower but accomplish more, that fatigue feels different, not depletion but recalibration. Small choices, food, posture, sleep, start aligning with subtle intuition instead of external rules. You eat when hungry, rest when tired, speak when words feel real. These may seem trivial, yet they signal the complete reorientation of the internal command system. The old voice, once obsessed with regulation, is replaced by intelligence, arising from direct contact with the present. There's also a distinct change in perception of time. Moments that once dragged or rushed now feel fluid. The mind no longer fragments experience into before and after. You sense a continuous thread connecting all movement, like a hum running through the fabric of events. Because attention is no longer hijacked by repetitive thought, energy that used to feed mental noise is redirected toward perception itself. You see more, hear more, and, perhaps most surprising, require less stimulation to feel alive. And perhaps the most definitive evidence of all, peace becomes practical. It stops being an idea or goal and becomes a function. You notice that stillness helps you solve problems faster, connect more deeply, and adapt without panic. Silence, once uncomfortable, turns operational. An active intelligence that moves through you, shaping words, timing, and gesture. At this stage, life and awareness begin to mirror each other completely. The boundary between inner and outer fades, not as abstraction, but as everyday efficiency. You realize that awakening isn't a detachment from reality, it's the full integration of it. And as this integration matures, a final clarity approaches. The recognition that the moment you notice who is speaking within you, consciousness has already crossed the threshold into full awakening. When you finally notice who is speaking within you, awakening is no longer an idea, it's already happening. The old voice, once the narrator of your life, becomes just one sound among many inside a much larger field of awareness. You realize that consciousness doesn't arrive with fanfare, it arrives in recognition, the quiet acknowledgement that you were never the voice, but the listener behind it. From that point on, every thought, every silence, every moment of presence becomes a doorway back to coherence. If you've stayed with me all the way to this moment, write "I am hearing myself clearly" in the comments. It's a small way of marking that awareness has reached you fully. And if this exploration resonated with you, Take a breath, stay in that clarity, and watch one of the videos now appearing on your screen. Each one continues this unfolding, not as information, but as direct experience of your own awakening voice.